Howdy folks, before we ride into this Wild West tale, do me a favor, hit that like button, leave a comment down below on what you'd have done if you were in this cowboy's boots, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story under the frontier sun. Now saddle up, because this is where it begins. The whistle of a train echoed across the prairie, carried on the dry evening wind. Caleb Hart tugged the reins of his horse, Dusty, pausing by the tracks that cut across the endless sweep of land. The sun was sinking, bleeding red across the sky, and he was thinking only of finding a quiet patch of ground to camp before night swallowed the desert. But then, something on the rails caught his eye. At first he thought it was a bundle of rags, maybe trash tossed off a freight car. Then the shape twitched. Caleb's jaw tightened. It was no bundle of rags. It was a child. The whistle grew louder, urgent now, and the iron beast in the distance was barreling closer. Caleb's instincts snapped sharp. He spurred Dusty hard, the horse lurching forward, hooves striking sparks from the stones. The girl was sprawled across the tracks, too thin, too weak to move. Every second hammered in his chest. He swung out of the saddle before Dusty had even stopped, boots pounding the ground. The train roared, the rails shuddering under his feet. Caleb grabbed the child by the shoulders and yanked her free, stumbling backward into the dirt as the locomotive screamed past in a storm of smoke and sparks. Heat and wind slammed into him, rattling his bones, then it was gone, thundering off into the horizon. For a long moment, Caleb sat in the dirt with the girl in his arms, both of them dusted in soot. She was a wisp of a thing, her face streaked with grime, hair tangled and dull, dress torn to threads. She clutched a faded rag doll against her chest, fingers locked tight around it even in her weakness. Her lips moved, but no words came out. "Easy, little one," Caleb muttered, his voice rough from disuse. "You're safe now." Her eyes fluttered shut, lashes trembling against her hollow cheeks. She was barely hanging on. Caleb cursed under his breath and lifted her into his arms. He could feel the ridges of her ribs beneath the cloth. Whoever she was, she hadn't eaten in days. Back at his camp, he set her down near the small fire he managed to coax from dried mesquite. His pack was nearly empty, he'd stretched supplies thin on his wandering, but he opened the last tin of beans, heated them over the flames, and spooned a few bites into the girl's mouth. She swallowed weakly, but it was enough. He tilted his canteen, letting a trickle of water wet her lips. When she had enough strength, she whispered a name. Annie. Just that, before her eyes slipped shut again. Caleb leaned back on his heels, staring at her small frame curled by the fire. He had not felt this weight in years, not since the night outlaws stormed his family's homestead and left him the only one standing. He had told himself then he'd never carry the burden of caring for another soul again. Better to ride alone, with nothing left to lose. But Annie's small hand, even in sleep, found the edge of his coat and clung there as if she knew he was already halfway gone. Caleb froze, staring at that fragile grip. A man could keep his distance from trouble, from war, from pain, but how did you walk away from a child who held onto you like you were her last breath of air? The fire cracked and popped in the silence. Caleb told himself he'd take her to the nearest town, hand her to the church or whoever had the means to care for her. That was the right thing. The smart thing. She needed more than he could give. Morning came pale and cold. Annie stirred, eyes fluttering open to reveal a soft hazel glow beneath the dirt. She tried to sit, wobbling, and Caleb steadied her. She was stubborn enough to wave off his hand once she found her balance, as though pride burned brighter than hunger. "I can help," she said, her voice hoarse. "You need rest," Caleb replied. "I can fetch kindling." She pointed toward the sparse brush. Her tiny legs trembled, but she shuffled off, gathering sticks in her thin arms. Caleb followed at a distance, shaking his head at her determination. When she returned, arms quivering under the weight, he almost smiled. Almost. Through the day she clung close, tending Dusty with gentle hands, asking questions in a steady stream. Did he have a family? Where was he headed? Why did he ride alone? Caleb gave her few answers, keeping his voice low and his heart guarded. But when night fell again, she sat beside him and stared at the sky. "My mama said the stars mean people are watching from heaven," she whispered. Her rag doll rested in her lap, threadbare but loved. "If I look hard enough, maybe she's still looking at me." Caleb tipped his hat back, gaze lifting to the endless black quilt overhead. He had not let himself believe in heaven, or stars that watched, not since the night he buried his kin. But beside Annie's trembling voice, the thought no longer felt like a child's fancy. He said nothing, only handed her his blanket when the chill crept in. She smiled faintly, nestling under the worn fabric. For the first time in years, Caleb felt the silence of the night not as loneliness, but as something near to peace. Still, as sleep pulled at him, one thought gnawed his mind. He could not stay by her side forever. He was a drifter, a man made for dust and distance. But when Annie shifted closer in her sleep, her small hand curling against his arm, he knew tomorrow would come harder than today. And deep down, though he would not yet admit it, he also knew this child had already tethered him to the world in a way he thought he'd lost forever. The fire burned low, shadows stretching long, and Caleb lay awake with the weight of a choice pressing heavier than any outlaw's bullet. Would he walk away? Or was this the beginning of something he never dared want again? The prairie whispered no answer, only the steady crackle of embers and the soft breathing of the girl who had nearly died on the tracks but might just become the reason he lived. The town of Dry Creek appeared on the horizon like a mirage, a scatter of wooden buildings huddled against the dust and wind. Caleb urged Dusty forward, Annie riding in front of him, her small frame pressed against his chest. She said little, but her fingers curled tight around the reins as though she feared if she let go, the world would take everything from her again. Caleb kept his eyes fixed ahead, telling himself he would deliver her into safe hands and be done. Yet the thought tasted bitter, like sand in his mouth. Dry Creek was no place of promise. Its main street lay empty but for a pair of mangy dogs and the faint sound of a piano clinking sour notes in the saloon. The sheriff's office leaned on its foundation as if a stiff wind might topple it. Caleb dismounted, lifting Annie down gently. He sought out the church, its bell tower crooked but still standing, hoping there he could leave her in peace. The preacher, an old man with stooped shoulders, met them at the door. His eyes softened when he saw Annie, but his mouth drew tight when Caleb asked if the church could take her in. "We barely feed our own," he confessed, voice cracking. "I'd keep her if I could, but the coffers are empty, and the town stretched thin." His glance slid to Caleb's worn revolver, then back to Annie. "Best she stay with you, at least a while longer." Annie's hand found Caleb's coat, clutching it as though the words sealed her fear. Caleb nodded stiffly, though his heart twisted. He turned to leave, but whispers from a group of men outside caught his ear. They spoke of ranches burned, cattle stolen, families run off their land. Caleb listened, silent, until Annie's voice broke the air. "It was them," she said, quiet but certain. Her eyes fixed on the men's talk of the Blackthorn Riders, a gang whose cruelty was etched into every face in town. "They're the ones who took Mama and Papa." Caleb crouched to meet her gaze. "You sure?" She nodded, jaw trembling but eyes fierce. "I'll never forget." Caleb straightened slowly, the weight of her words heavy as lead. He had ridden from fight after fight, claiming no cause but survival. He told himself he had no stake in this war. Yet Annie's stare burned through his excuses, raw with grief and expectation. That night, as they camped beyond the edge of town, Annie broke the silence. "You saved me once," she said, her small voice cutting sharper than any blade. "Don't let them win again." Caleb looked into the fire, seeing not the flames but the ghosts of his past, the night his own family had been slaughtered by men much like the Riders, the guilt that had driven him into the wilderness of his own soul. Annie's plea tore open wounds he thought scarred over. He realized she wasn't just asking him to fight for her. She was asking him to fight for himself, to stand against the shadows that had consumed him. At dawn, he cleaned his revolver with slow precision, checked the rifle slung across his saddle, and tested the edge of his knife. Annie watched without fear, her small hands passing him cartridges as though she had been born to this ritual. When he lifted his hat and set it firm on his head, she smiled faintly, as though she knew he had made his choice. They rode to the old railroad bridge, where Caleb had first pulled her from Death's grip. It was here he would make his stand. He set Annie behind a stack of timbers, safe but close, and laid out his rifle across the rail supports. The wind carried the sound of hooves long before the riders appeared, black shapes cresting the hill, dust clouds boiling behind them. The Blackthorn riders thundered forward, a dozen men with bandanas over their faces and cruelty in their eyes. Caleb's finger curled around the trigger, breath steady, every muscle honed to the rhythm of battle. The first shot cracked like thunder, dropping a rider from his saddle. Chaos erupted. Gunfire roared, bullets sparking off metal and stone. Caleb shifted with deadly calm, each shot placed with surgical precision. Dusty reared nearby, whinnying against the thunder of hooves. The riders split, some charging for cover, others rushing the bridge. One outlaw spotted Annie, crouched in the shadows, and swung down from his horse. He stalked toward her, knife flashing. Annie's ragdoll slipped from her grip, but she did not scream. Instead, she snatched a rock and hurled it, striking his forehead. He cursed, stumbling, and Caleb's revolver barked once. The man fell hard into the dust. The gang leader, a tall brute with a scar slicing across his face, spurred his horse straight at the bridge. His revolver spat fire, bullets tearing splinters from the beams around Caleb. Caleb dropped his rifle, drew his Colt, and met the charge head-on. They faced each other at 10 paces, smoke swirling, the world narrowing to two men bound by violence and fate. The leader sneered, raising his gun, but Caleb was faster. His shot rang out, clean and final, striking the man square. The scarred brute toppled from his saddle, lifeless before he hit the ground. The remaining riders scattered, spurred by fear more than loyalty. In the sudden quiet, the wind whispered through the bridge timbers, carrying the echo of retreating hooves. Caleb stood, smoke drifting from his barrel, chest heaving. Annie ran to him, flinging her arms around his waist. "You did it," she whispered, face pressed against him. Caleb looked down at her, the weight of the moment sinking deep. He had not just fought for survival this time. He had fought for her, and for the part of himself he thought long dead. He holstered his gun slowly, resting a hand on her small shoulder. By the time they returned to town, the air was different. The same men who had whispered in fear now stood taller, their eyes following Caleb with newfound respect. The sheriff offered him a badge, a place among them. Caleb only shook his head. He wasn't meant to be tied to a post. But when he lifted Annie onto Dusty's saddle, her smile lit brighter than the morning sun. He knew he wasn't meant to ride alone either. They set out at dusk, horizon wide and waiting. Annie hummed softly, her ragdoll tucked safe in her arms, while Caleb allowed the rare curl of a smile to touch his face. The land was still harsh, the road still long, but for the first time in years, the weight on his shoulders felt less like grief and more like purpose. He had pulled her from the tracks, and in return, she had pulled him back to life. Together, they rode into the fading light, two souls stitched together by fate, the promise of tomorrow stronger than the shadows of the past.